The Supreme Court takes on affirmative action. Georgia has guns everywhere. Net neutrality, and another Earth Day has come and gone. I'm John Romero, and this is the Square Circle. Hello, and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, John Romero. Joining us today are PhD candidate James Hedrick, Nick Morpus of Liberty Minds, and Derek Pugh of the Campaign for America's Future. The biggest story this week was the Supreme Court case involving affirmative action. Court let stand the Michigan ballot initiative that prohibits public universities in the state from using race as a factor in their admission practices. Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote, "This case is not about how the debate about racial preferences should be resolved. It is about who may resolve it." Justice Sonia Sotomayor took the unusual step of reading her opinion from the bench, saying we ought not sit back and wish away rather than confront the racial inequality that exists in our society. James Hedrick, who is right here?
John, I'm not sure if anybody is right or wrong. The courts upheld the citizens of Michigan's decision through ballot initiative to be able to say that you can't consider race as a part of admission for higher education. I think the bigger question, the bigger issue that we're going to come across here is this is going to open the floodgates to reconsidering a lot of civil rights cases from the 60s and 70s when determining whether a city, whether a state, whether a county can restrict the access of minorities to different government services. And so I think that we're going to see a lot of court cases like this in the future.
Derek, any thoughts?
Well, I would echo his thoughts and also say that I think the decision was wrongly made. If you look at previous court cases, especially Washington versus Seattle, you see that the political process doctrine is in place and it should have upheld the affirmative action. So I think it's a travesty that we're doing away and slowly whittling away at the things that have made America great, and that's making sure there's opportunity for everyone in this country.
Nick, where do you stand?
Well, I see this as more of the interest of the people taking responsibility for racial issues. You have this idea that now all of a sudden that, essentially, yes, racism is still here. However, you have the fact that people abhor racism on a massive level in this country. So to say that we need a government to continue, back during the time of the Civil Rights era, yes, you probably needed a lot of these different things. However, looking at it now, is if you have people discriminating other people, it's intolerable nowadays. No one will tolerate it. So, and the issue of affirmative action, this whole idea that we have to discriminate on the basis of race, which that's essentially what it is. Affirmative action is discrimination because it's singling out people for the color of their skin. I look at this as possibly kind of a backwards way to look at the whole idea of getting rid of racism.
I would take issue with it being within the concept of discrimination. It's not discrimination, it's allowing to consider race and other factors as one part of consideration for access to state services, access to public education. I don't get the term of discrimination one way or the other. What it is being able to consider that in a broad range of factors. It's all that affirmative action is, at least in the case of Michigan's higher education. And then a second point that I think comes from this particular court case is that if this is the way that the court is going to move, and I think you've got a fairly large majority, 6-2, in favor of this particular decision, although no clear majority decision, no clear majority opinion coming out of it. You got a three-way split majority. I think what you might see is a blessing in disguise for anyone that's concerned about issues of race, class, gender in the country, and the fact that you've seen a lot of other states do away with considering race in admissions and actually increase the access for people that are low to moderate income. So I think this might be a blessing in disguise if you move that to a question of class and be able to consider neighborhood, geography factors, wealth, and income as a portion of as part of the consideration for access to higher education.
Any final thoughts, Nick, Derek?
Well, I would look at it as we should be focusing on more merit-based rather than just looking at skin color. The fact that we are going to look at skin color and make that a determining factor in someone actually being admitted into a school can, at times, allow schools to make poor choices in bringing in students. It could possibly lead to someone who was more meritorious in getting into the school not being allowed in because their spot was taken by someone who had been brought in for superficial reasons such as skin color.
I don't think skin color is superficial at all. I think it's ingrained in our society, and we need to treat it as such, and therefore we need policies. You're saying that it's intolerable to be racist anymore and to deny people certain privileges, but we saw with the gays in Arizona and other bills that really what's happening is you're saying everything should be private. This is privatization, whether it be on the school system or with small businesses, and we have to make sure that there are protections in place for people because, as you said, racism does exist, and we all acknowledge that, so we need to have policies that fight that.
I would have to retort and say that, and especially I'm glad you actually brought up the Arizona law. The Arizona law is not what they call, it's the gay discrimination bill. The idea of it was to give people the choice whether or not to be discriminatory, which, you can't legislate, you just can't legislate tolerance. It doesn't happen. It has to come naturally. So in order for the Arizona bill to actually work, you have to have a responsible people to call out racism when they see it. Say a store were to come out tomorrow and say that, they were going to no longer serve blacks. You can guarantee that there would be people demonstrating in front of the store. That place would be picketed out of business before they could even change their slogan and say, okay, wait, no, we're going to let people in. And, it's just absurd to think that you actually need the government there when it's supposed to be the people who are supposed to keep other people in check.
It's absurd to think we don't. And going back to the Civil War, if we would let people vote, they would still have their slaves and they would be part of this country.
What about England? England got rid of slavery without a civil war.
Yes, but England's not America.
The Civil War was not fought on the basis of slavery.
England is not America.
I think the broader point that comes out is the question of whether or not one can legislate tolerance, as you mentioned earlier. And I think that the clear case can be made historically that one definitely can legislate tolerance, and not only legislate tolerance, but enforce tolerance at the end of a gun, which is exactly what happened during the Civil Rights Movement. Nobody went into Arkansas high schools and made everybody feel nice about individuals and let them in on the basis of their opinion. What they did was put the National Guard in there and make them do it at the point of a gun. That's legislating tolerance. You must allow these people in, and over time that becomes actual tolerance. This is what the Civil Rights Act, this is what the Voting Rights Act, this is what all the legislation, the court cases in the 60s and 70s, and even earlier in the 50s did, was basically enforce tolerance from the top down, and has made a more tolerant society.
I would say that's more tolerance, that's more forcing racism underground. However, I would agree that the next generation, current generation, is a lot more tolerant. Mm-hmm. So I would argue that the fact that that this generation is more tolerant and teaching the next generation an even higher degree of tolerance, that these government mandates, these laws to prevent people from free expression, no matter how abhorrent. The First Amendment was drawn up not so we could discuss the weather, as Ron Paul would say, but it was to cover controversial speech. And to say that we cannot engage in that controversial speech kind of undermines our whole principles of First Amendment, free association.
There's absolutely nothing that says you can't engage in controversial speech. Anyone can engage in controversial speech. What you have to do is then put up with the consequences of said controversial speech. Well, and if you're engaged in commerce, what you cannot do is restrict access to commerce to an individual based on the color of their skin or any of a variety of other civil rights.
But shouldn't that be the responsibility of the people to do so?
No, in no way, shape, or form should it be the responsibility of the people to enforce that. That's the reason that you
hold
have
people
laws
accountable?
to protect vulnerable minorities.
Why we pay taxes, so we can all pay into this great society. And those taxes do cover the protection of minorities in the society. And although our generation is more tolerant, we're not in charge of admitting people to institutions of higher education yet. So we still need.
Well, you certainly have the. I'm going to harken back to my libertarian roots on this and say that that's the power of the markets. The people will decide through the power of the market whether or not something is tolerant or not. Like I said with the store, if they decided, hey, we're not going to admit black people in our store, whether it be through hiring or it be through sales or any sort of factor, you would have demonstrations. That place would be out of business. No one would want to shop there. I would take an example of history.
Or for Cracker Barrel, that the Justice Department has fined several times for discriminatory practices, and Southerners have not stopped frequenting those locations yet.
The purpose of the laws is that one cannot change hearts and minds over time, and the laws must be enforced so as to allow free access and free ability. The ability of myself to participate in free speech and free expression and free enterprise is not the same as another individual's, based on either income, based on the color of their skin, based on a lot of things.
And I also want to note that I think it's particularly interesting that a bunch of white men are sitting around discussing this topic, because it doesn't affect any of us. So
that's kind of an absurd claim, really, to make. I mean, black people are not the only people that have
against for being a white man in this country.
Well, I'd have to say that it's not. We're not the only. The black people are not the only race who've ever been discriminated. Every race in any point of history has felt some sort of discrimination.
Black, I just said white.
Well, I know, but to say that whites don't have a discussion on the topic is kind of absurd. That means that, well, anything that doesn't necessarily affect you means that you have absolutely no say, whether it be on one side of the issue or the other. It's kind of like a way to shut down a discussion.
I noticed that you didn't have a say in it. I'm saying that it would be nice to have a person of color who is actually affected by these policies.
Clarence Thomas.
Well, if you look through Clarence Thomas's quotes, he has also made profound statements saying that regardless, he is a black man and he's faced more challenges than any white man will ever face in this country. And it's true. And if you look at the demography of the Libertarian Party, you have, over 90% being whites. I mean, they're male, they're well educated, so of course they're going to advocate for policies that benefit them, because people are self-interested, and that's why we need the active government and affirmative action.
I'd like to remind our audience that you can submit your questions to our guests through our website, www.publicsquare.net, and we'll answer as many as we can on air toward the end of the show. Second big story this week comes out of the state of Georgia, where the governor signed a new law called by some Guns Everywhere. It allows citizens to carry guns in such places as bars, churches, and government buildings, subject to some restrictions. Supporters say it will make these places more safe. Critics say the exact opposite. Nick Morpus, do more guns make society safer?
Certainly do. I mean, honestly, if you kind of look at it, you look at all these recent stories like the second Fort Hood shooting. Second time there, it's a gun-free zone. You look at all the school shootings that happen, they're all gun-free zones. And most of the time when you have places where someone is carrying a gun there to protect themselves or protect other people, you have a less high murder rate at those certain locations. So yes, I certainly do believe that guns make places safer, and especially in the sense that criminals aren't going to go through the legitimate means to get them. So having someone legitimately there with a firearm who's not a criminal certainly will make the place safer.
Derek?
Criminals get their hands on guns easier than kids with candy. So that's the first comment.
Oh, that's my little brother.
I guess it depends what state in Georgia.
Those candy regulations.
Free kindergarten. But overall, I think the issue is not gun-free zones. It's people bringing guns into those, which is putting guns into the hands of dangerous people. So the less guns we have, the less people we have to enter those zones. It's not the zone that's the issue. It's the people carrying the arms weapons.
James?
There's a couple of different issues that come up with this. For first and foremost, more guns don't make people safer. All right. When you look at across states, when you look at across cities, lower levels of guns, lower gun ownership, lower numbers of firearms, all equal less homicide. The correlation is pretty clear. More guns don't make people safer, and you have to really cherry pick the particular instances of mass shootings, which is a completely different situation. It's not the same as gun safety. All right, the Fort Hood shooting is not the major issue with gun safety. All right. But you have to really cherry pick your ideas to find situations in which having other people with guns there actually made the situation safer. Your likelihood of having a gun, the likelihood of another gun being there makes the likelihood of somebody else being injured much higher. It makes the likelihood of somebody else being shot much higher. And it makes it much more difficult for the authorities to actually determine who the bad guy is in a given situation. Because when you come into a situation where people are firing guns at one another, it's really hard to make it stop, figure out which one is the bad guy, and then shoot them. All right, so it doesn't make people safer. The other consideration is, of course, the Second Amendment and whether or not this is constitutional. And I think that we, as a society, make a lot more restrictions on people, put a lot more restrictions on people driving than we do on gun ownership. And I happen to think that one is much more dangerous than the other. All right, and if you're going to have this kind of open carry, guns everywhere situation, you have to license it. And if you do license it, you're going to reduce the number of guns, make people safer, and make me happier anyway. So.
One of our readers actually did touch upon this topic, asking, kind of going off James said, as a shooting happens, there's initial confusion, a bunch of people start shooting. How do you know who's the bad guy and good guy when you come into one of those instances? So, Nick, you can tackle that topic as well as any others that were obviously thrown out there.
Well, first I want to cover on this subject that the bill was not meant to put guns in the hands of everybody. Everyone has a decision whether or not they want to own a firearm. However, those who are criminals certainly are not going to abide by the law, whether it's there or not. If there's a restriction on someone going into a church with a gun, a criminal's not going to come up to a church and say, oh, wait, I can't be here with a gun. Maybe I should go somewhere else. It's completely absurd to think that the idea that this law is in place is going to stop criminals from shooting other people in places where guns are not supposed to be. Is completely absurd. I mean, would you be more likely, if you were a criminal, to walk into a building where there's a higher likelihood of someone carrying a gun that could stop you, or would you be more likely to walk into somewhere where people do not have guns? I mean, it's pretty obvious. If you're out to kill someone, you're going to go down the path of least resistance. It's kind of absurd to think that, if we just make sure that there's a law that says there's no guns in churches, no guns in bars, no guns in here, there, or anywhere, that there will be no shootings. It's completely absurd.
John, if I can respond?
Sure.
A couple of things that come in there. One, you're predisposing that criminality is decided upon before the act takes place. A criminal is an individual in and of himself or herself that has decided that they're going to be a criminal and commit a criminal act. All right. Most of the situations that you're talking about that I'm primarily concerned with on the question of safety is somebody getting upset and angry in a bar and having access not just to their fists or a bar stool or a pool cue, but a gun. All right. Guns may not kill people, people may kill people, but it certainly makes it a heck of a lot easier. Secondly, the issue of being able to carry guns into particular places is a situation that I want to have. I want restrictions upon that. I want restrictions upon that for a couple of reasons. One, I want any security that happens to be there or any authorities that happen to be there to be awfully suspicious of anyone carrying a gun into a church, a bar, or a school. All right, I want that to be an actual issue that comes up, that those people are paid high attention to when one carries them in a situation like that. And the second thing is that restricting that does make them safer. All right, if a teacher's having a bad day at a child, I don't want them having access to a gun. If a principal's about to get fired, I don't want to have them having access to a gun. If a janitor's come on and had a bad day, I don't want to have them access to a gun. I certainly don't want their immediate reaction and emotional reaction. All right, you're saying that criminals take the path of least resistance. I'm arguing it's not a rational choice most of the time. Anybody that starts to shoot up a place is not making a rational decision. All right, they're making an emotional one. If a janitor's having a bad day and has access to a gun, I don't want him to be in the school with it. Well, I don't want him to be illegally in the school with it.
Well, you have to look at it when it comes to someone carrying such as a school. I would argue that it would be up to the school then to decide the policy of whether or not teachers will be allowed to carry guns. For instance, the school could put in place barriers saying, well, you have to have these tests done, you have to have a concealed carry, clean record, things like that. And also, things such as someone just pulling out a gun and shooting someone, perhaps maybe there should be restrictions. Or, and some people have the fear of possibly students grabbing the gun and shooting another person, possibly having it being an anonymous carry with someone who's actually trusted. I mean, a teacher is really no different than a police officer if the teacher is actually trained to own and wield a firearm.
A teacher is completely different than a police officer, even if they've had a small amount of training. There's a difference between me and a stock car driver. A stock car driver does it for a living. I know how to drive a car because I can parallel park. All right. Well, the difference between a teacher that's trained and a police officer that does it on a constant basis is
there are many private citizens who have plenty of training on firearms who could shoot just as good, if not better, than police officers. And
to
say that a police officer in and itself is a much more trustworthy person than a teacher is kind of disingenuous.
I'm not saying that they're more trustworthy. I'm saying that they have the responsibility the teacher does not. It's the responsibility of the police officers and the law enforcement force to enforce the law and to maintain the peace. It's not the teacher's job. The teacher's job is education. The school's job is education. They are not, and private citizens are not vigilantes. They should not carry guns. They should not enforce the law on their own, and they should not have that responsibility or be given it.
Let's give Derek an opportunity here.
And I think a point that's being missed here is the psychological effect of carrying guns around children. They're seeing this violence already in video games, and now they're seeing their teachers carrying it around for no good reason. I mean, we're setting up a future generation to be very comfortable with guns when children are horrible with guns already, and there are, hundreds and even thousands of deaths from children using arms and not knowing what to do with them. So making them even more comfortable with guns, I think, is not what we want to be doing with our future generation. We need to be looking at policies that solve why people are killing in the first place and not giving them arms to do that through.
Well, people have been killing each other long before the invention of the firearm. However, I say it would be a positive thing to actually make children more comfortable around guns, but not only that, make the responsibility of society to teach responsible gun ownership, teach to respect life. I mean, you have.
Why
I know
do
many.
that through a gun, though? Why can't we do it through other venues?
Well, I mean, if you want to defend yourself, a gun is a very efficient way to do so, and it's a good thing to teach a child. It's a good thing to teach a child from a very young age responsible gun ownership. Teach them. I mean, when I learned how to fire a gun, I'm a card-carrying member of the NRA. I've fired many firearms. The first thing they teach you when you fire a gun is to know that this can kill someone. This is a weapon. This is something that can be used to defend. It can be used to attack. It can be used for many different purposes, but all of them which are deadly. And you teach a child to respect that rather than just teach them, oh, well, you have to stay away from guns. They're dangerous. They're dangerous. Of course they're dangerous, but a car is dangerous. A ship is dangerous. A boat, anything, it can be dangerous. A knife is dangerous. And just because something is dangerous doesn't mean we should shelter children from them. Instead, we should embrace this type of culture and show them a responsible way to handle these types of things rather than fear-mongering and telling them, oh, you have to stay away from guns, zero-tolerance policies, we're going to suspend you if you put your hand in the shape of a gun. I mean, these types of ideas are absolutely ridiculous.
This would, and just going off what you're saying, it would be on every parent of every student to be teaching. But if parents don't agree with that, then how do you factor?
That's the beauty of freedom. That's the beauty of liberty. You have the decision whether or not to teach your children these types of things, and it should be put on the responsibility of the parents to do so either way. But I look at it as, rather than creating a society of people who are fearful of people owning firearms, we should be instead embracing a society where we respect the power and nature of a gun, but teach people responsible ownership rather than just fear.
And if we really wanted a society that's not fearful of guns, the best way we could achieve that is by not having guns readily available. Because, as you were saying, criminals are going to go into places, they're going to do whatever, but they'll be deterred because other people have guns. This is basically saying that they are fearful of being shot and killed themselves. We should not be imposing fear. We need to actually focus on policies that address homicide, because most homicides are related with gun violence, and that's a simple fact in this country.
Okay, moving on. Also this week, the Federal Communications Commission took on the issue of net neutrality once again. Those favoring a more activist role for the FCC in internet regulation were disappointed when the FCC announced new proposed rules that would allow internet service providers to negotiate fees with content providers that require high bandwidth. James Hedrick, could you unpack this issue so our viewers can understand?
Certainly. I think one of the ways to look at this is basically old technology companies versus new technology companies, or access companies versus content creators. And what you have with this issue of net neutrality and what these rules basically really mean is that you've got people like Verizon, Comcast, who are going to be able to basically charge both you on the front end for accessing the internet and companies on the back end for providing you content at reasonable speed. All right, and I think that that's probably going to lead to a couple of things. It's going to lead to access discrimination. All right, if rules like this have been in place in the early part of the internet, we'd all be using MySpace instead of Facebook. and I don't see anyone probably around here that uses MySpace, unless you're in a band. They did pivot pretty well. Like I said, you got a double dip situation with the service providers getting money both from the consumer and from the back end companies that need to provide the content, and plus it's going to stifle innovation because you're going to significantly increase the barriers to access for internet. For businesses to start on the internet, for them to create new products, basically for them to innovate in general.
Derek?
Yes, and it's going to give certain companies almost monopoly over the internet, as you have Comcast providing all these high-speed services because you're going to want the high speed and you're going to be willing to pay for it in today's day and age. I mean, it's the fast lane to nowhere for the American consumer.
As much as I do agree that the internet is very useful, it is what you say it is. However, I have to look at it in the sense that this stifles back to, this harkens back to an even bigger problem rather than just net neutrality. You have to look at the fact that cable companies such as themselves are monopolies, but they are not monopolies by themselves. They are monopolies because the government allows them to be so. You have all these different types of contracts that cable companies must abide by just to be able to put cable down. And what it does is it creates barriers to entry for other cable companies, such as possibly Google Wire? Is that what it was called? I believe that's what it's called.
Oh, for putting wireless access.
You have Verizon Fios. You have all these different types of things trying to come into the market. It's a lot harder for them to do so because the established companies are already there. They've already laid the cable. They've already laid all the foundations necessary to be a successful cable company. And I would look at it in the sense that allowing a free market decision, like getting rid of the net neutrality thing, wouldn't be so much a problem if we didn't actually have a government-created monopoly in cable in the first place. If you were to have more cable companies and internet service providers in the actual market, you'd be able to decide which ones you want to go with, and this would lead to much more competition between the different internet service providers. And those who engage in more discriminatory acts, of course, would suffer under the market because people will want to get to the websites they want to get to. I mean, you have the instance of, for instance, I'm going to liken this to internet on phones. You have Verizon and AT&T. They don't offer unlimited internet anymore. You have to pay by the gigabyte. I switched from Verizon to Sprint basically on that exact reason. I wanted unlimited internet and I wanted a smartphone, and I didn't want to pay an arm and a leg for it, so I went over to Sprint. And their business actually has been growing, whereas Verizon's has been starting to stagnate because of these types of policies. People can't afford to be on Verizon right now. It's still a down economy. So I look at it as a free market decision that harkens back to government being involved in this type of industry in the first place, protecting some and then creating barriers to entry for competition for others.
I think we all can agree this issue is probably not going to get settled anytime soon. So what do you see down the road? Well, let's tackle it this way. What do you see happening down the road as this issue continues to kind of...
You're going to see the FCC has a couple of options. There's information services and telecommunications services, and they've defined internet service providers as one, and they can very easily go back and redo their own rule to define it as the other one. And then they can take this back. Essentially, they end up going back to court, but it looks like the FCC is not going to do that. That they're going to that they've put out these proposed rules that would basically scrap net neutrality. So there's going to be a large fight over it. I think the best analogy would probably be the SOPA fight of a couple months, maybe a year or so ago.
That was like a little
maybe a year
ago.
or so ago. Yeah, maybe a little bit further back than I'm thinking. But I think that we'll get something more like that. It's really going to galvanize people. I think it's going to galvanize the content providing companies. I think it's going to galvanize people like Google, Facebook, Netflix, people that are putting services and things out there, basically to argue against these kind of rules and this scrapping net neutrality. So I think we're going to see a lot of regulatory fights coming up over the next couple of months.
Another Earth Day came and went this week. This year, though, many environmentalists were in a retrospective mood, taking stock of the successes and failures of the environmental movement over the last several decades. Derek Pugh, where does the movement stand now, and what does the future hold?
Well, the future right now is not looking too bright, considering that the commitments we made in the Copenhagen Accord in 2009 have not been fulfilled or even close to being fulfilled. And we see now with the droughts and the hurricanes and all these natural disasters occurring that can directly be attributed to climate change, that we are worse off than we have been. And if we continue on the path that we're on, it's only going to continue to get worse.
James?
There's a couple things if you're going to be retrospective about the environment on Earth Day. Is the movement's made a lot of positive strides over the last several decades. Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, things of that nature. Reduction in lead in the environment's been a huge one. There's been several papers that have been written, there's been a couple papers that have been written arguing that's led to a significant decline in criminality, is a lack of lead in the environment. You've got subsidies for a budding clean energy economy that I think is going to eventually take off with solar, wind power, hydroelectric. I'm a big fan of nuclear, although that puts me on the wrong side of a lot of environmentalists. I think that going forward, what you're going to look at, love me some nuclear power. I think what you're going to get going forward is you're going to have to address the impact of climate change because it's going to happen. There's going to be a raise in global temperatures, and that's going to have an effect. So I think the environmental movement's going to have to deal with how to address the effects of climate change are going to have on individuals. The second part of it is there's been a lot of structural successes in the environmental movement, like I said, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. I think that really what they're going to have to address in the future is behavioral changes. Reduction in the amount of meat that people eat, because agriculture is a big contributor to the environmental problem. Public transportation, biking, stuff like that. You're going to have a real sea change in behavioral, in the behavior of individuals in this country.
Nick?
I have to apologize if I don't see the... I'm all for it. If people want a cleaner earth, if people want cleaner air, cleaner water, I am all for that. In fact, I'm actually quite the supporter of Tesla. I actually love their cars. I think they're beautiful. Of course, I don't have $70,000 sitting in my bank account for a Tesla. But you have the issue with government instead getting involved and deciding, picking the winners and losers in an economy. Who's going to win when it comes to clean energy subsidies and so on and so forth. But you have issues with these clean energy companies where it's not really to clean up the environment. These are instances of cronyism. You have Solyndra. These people who engage in all these different types of markets are people who either helped support the current president be elected, help bundle for his campaign, donate to his campaign. They become the leaders of these organizations. But getting back to the idea of the Earth with climate change, you have had, for instance, the last hurricane season was quite the quiet hurricane season, if I do remember. And honestly, when it comes to these fear-mongering tactics of saying that storms are getting worse, hurricanes are getting worse, you have temperatures rising, they've been saying that for decades now, and we haven't seen a massive increase in temperature. In fact, we've actually seen much of a decrease in temperature, especially if you're living in D.C. But
I would have to jump in here and argue that that's actually incorrect. We've had almost 30 straight years of above average of the average temperature being above average for the 19th and 20th century. So you've seen global temperatures rise significantly. You've seen average temperatures in some parts of the United States dip, and that's because global warming and climate change are not the same.
These are studies, though, I've seen that have said that are UN studies. However, I've seen many other private studies done by other climate scientists, and governments are not immune to being to doctoring facts in order to support a claim, because how else will they get their funding if they don't have a reason to get it?
I think that you're positing a massive global conspiracy with absolutely no proof.
No, I don't believe it's a global.
And if there's a private company that's
it's not a global conspiracy. It's very simple to say.
It's not real, and it's not affecting us. This is an issue that we are going to have to address one way or another. So leave it up to personal
10
choices.
years ago, people were saying that right now we were going to have to be addressing these now. We've had record high amounts of ice covering the polar caps.
The fact that you're even debating global warming with me, and if it's real or not, and if it's going to happen, is an issue. And it's a huge issue. And speaking of picking the winners and losers in this economy, sorry to go off topic, yes, the green movement has received subsidies, but not nearly as close as oil companies.
And I honestly don't agree with oil companies getting so. I don't believe anybody should.
Corporate welfare is much higher than any type of environment.
Again, I'm not arguing the numbers here. I'm arguing the merit of...
You're arguing global warming.
No.
Do you believe in global warming?
Well, I'm going back to your point. You brought up subsidies. I'm arguing when it comes to subsidies, I don't think anybody should be getting subsidies. If people really believe that the Earth is warming and that there's really issues with our climate, then people will start investing. We'll start buying more Priuses. People will start buying more hybrids.
We've seen that.
Of course, not without government with the EPA mandating certain fuel standards.
Because it needs to mandate those. We are all living on this earth together. Just because you want to drive a F-150 and pollute the earth, that's encroaching on my personal liberty. That's encroaching on my future children's environments. You are destroying our economy.
In the parlance of economics, it's referred to as a negative externality. And what you're having is the fact that many things are not, and this goes back to economics, many things are not costed at their actual cost, either to the individual or to society. All right, and the fact that cafe standards are coming up in this situation is, yes, you have to have government mandates to mandate higher cafe standards. There is no market that is going to drive that. There is no market that is going to make that happen, because the decision to buy a car is multifaceted. All right, there are many things that go into the decision to buy a car and what you need, maybe size, maybe family size, maybe a bunch of different things. But you're going to have some sort of mandate to encourage companies to build cars that are much more energy efficient. All right, that's not something that you can. That's not something that you can leave up to the market or consumers.
Of course you can.
It won't happen.
Of course you can.
It won't happen. Not with the speed that you need it to. Not with the speed that you need it to reduce this, and certainly not with the speed that you need it to reduce air pollution in particular cities. All right, Houston, I'd love to make a decision. I used to live in Houston, Texas. I'd love to make a decision not to drive in sometimes, but that's just simply not possible.
All right, I'd argue that if you really want people to have more available access to these types of things, for instance, Priuses are expensive, Volts are expensive, Teslas are expensive. Yet a lot of these companies are the ones who get the subsidies that supposedly are supposed to make these cheaper.
Most of the subsidies are actually
going
to tax breaks to individuals that are purchasing the cars themselves, not to the companies.
GM received subsidies to build the Volt.
Of course they did.
Every dollar we invest in R&D returns almost twice of its value back. These are smart investments that we need to make one way or another. We might as well make them now. What
incentive would a company have to lower their prices if they're going to get subsidized to build a car regardless?
They don't have importance. It's not. For one, the subsidies are not basically subsidies to build the car. They're basically tax breaks or depreciation on research and development, basically creating an incentive for a company to do more research and development than basically be concerned with the next stock quarter. Well, all right? That's what you're talking about when you're talking about corporate subsidies. We can get into a debate about that. But what you do have is a government that can basically go in there and affect the incentives of a company to produce cleaner burning cars rather than not cleaner burning cars.
I wouldn't call them incentives. They're more like punishments. If you don't build what we want you to build, then we're going to punish you for that.
That's not even the case.
It's to advance our environmental goal of rolling back global warming.
Then how can you explain the fact that they're going to they give subsidies to farmers to put corn into oil, which of course makes cars burn less efficiently, which hurts the environment more. Yeah. These ideas that you have to put this money in, that the government has to get involved
those are not two equal things. All right, I agree that agricultural.
I agree. Money into it.
The agricultural subsidies were not environmental in the first place, and their continuance is basically an example of basic interest group politics, and that you've got somebody that's got a concentrated benefit that wants to maintain it. So agricultural subsidies are a bad idea environmentally, and I agree with you there, but they're not equivalent to the subsidies to encourage R&D for green energy, whether it be solar, whether it be wind, or whether it be
a lot of the people who use things such as like ethanol as their basis, they use them on the basis of environmental benefit. And then going back to things like wind farms and solar, I say if people want to build those things, I say great, you go and build them. But you have this whole problem of taking money out of the pockets of people who actually need it, and instead investing into a losing market. Markets like solar power, Solyndra. You have issues with wind farms not coming up with the money to actually come clean, to actually be able to pay back those subsidies.
People that need the money. You said these people need this money.
The people of the United States. The people of the United States.
So you're saying the government is taking money from?
Very simple. Taxes is taking money from someone else, and when you subsidize something, you're taking money from someone else and giving it to another person. So what we're doing is effectively taking money out of the market, out of people who would spend that money on things maybe that you would like them to spend it on, like a Prius, and instead taking and invested into companies who will build stuff that you like them to build.
That is incorrect.
And that's exactly what taxes are.
Most of these subsidies aren't coming from taxpayer dollars because that's
where would they come
going
from,
to the deficit. We're borrowing it.
We're not borrowing money anymore. We print it, which devalues, of course, the currency and takes essentially.
Our currency has not been devalued. Inflation has not rose.
Of course it has.
So now we'll move on to our most underreported story of the week. Derek, I want you to start things off. Your most underreported story of the week.
So the New York Times released their front page article, which actually hasn't received a lot of attention, but it was looking at the war on poverty, and it focused on McDowell, West Virginia. And McDowell was actually the town that when Kennedy was a senator campaigning, he went to, and it basically made him create the modern-day food stamp program. That was his first executive order. And it's looking at poverty and like horribly impoverished people, and it goes back to King Cole in that whole argument. But one of the big takeaways I found from it in today's current debate about poverty in the U.S. is focused a lot on the inner city, when in fact 85% of the poorest counties are in rural districts. So I'm surprised that story did not get more attention. So that's my most unreported story.
James, your turn. What is your most underreported story of the week?
Actually, surprisingly enough, Northwestern athletes are voting whether or not to join a union today. I still don't think that story is getting enough press. I think it's very interesting, and I think in a couple of years, probably by the end of the decade, you're going to see the NCAA subsidizing athletes either through some sort of payment or stipend system. And I think it's going to really be an interesting story moving forward. Also, rural areas tend not to have any people, which is probably something around why they're not reported on more. I do a lot of work in rural areas.
Nick, your underreported story of the week?
The Malaysian airplane. No. I
actually
saw
something about it. I got excited. I was like, I haven't heard about this.
I mean, if you've been watching CNN, you haven't heard anything about it.
No, it's like we're still combing the Indian Ocean.
But no, I mean, I don't think it deserves a ton of press, but it is a little underreported. It's pretty interesting to look at. Yesterday, the Politico reported on a Colorado poll done by Quinnipiac that Rand Paul is ahead of Hillary Clinton in the polls for 2016. Now, granted, we're still years out from the election, and of course, usually polls like this don't really matter. However, it's pretty interesting to see, judging by the fact that the left has already essentially back on their 2008 horse of coronating Hillary Clinton as their nominee for president. I mean, Joe Biden's in a pathetic second, so I don't see him actually getting the nomination. But still, to say that it's pretty interesting to see someone as high-profile figure as Hillary Clinton coming up second to Rand Paul is pretty interesting, and it's kind of telling in a way, especially with people like Jeb Bush, who kissing the rings of the rich Republican donors, releasing saying that he's thinking about running for president. It's pretty interesting to see Rand Paul showing up as much as he is.
Well, I believe that's going to do it for this edition of The Square Circle. We will be back next week. Tune in, and the usual